Funding for Market Journal is provided by the Nebraska Soybean Board.
America's export of soybeans helps the U.S. maintain a positive agricultural trade balance. Nebraska contributes half of its soybeans for export. The protein and oil content in soybeans enhance the growing demand for higher protein diets. The Nebraska Soybean Board promotes research to develop new soybean varieties with higher protein and oil content for major agricultural markets. The Nebraska Soybean Checkoff, growing opportunity from the ground up.
Market Journal, television for agricultural business decisions, is a presentation of the University of Nebraska-Lincoln's Institute of Agriculture and Natural Resources. Promotional support is provided by the Nebraska Farmer Magazine, and major funding for Market Journal is provided by the Nebraska Soybean Board. The Soybean Checkoff, growing opportunity from the ground up.
Welcome to this week's edition of Market Journal. I'm Jeff Wilkerson. On this episode, Roy Smith analyzes market reaction to this week's USDA reports. Ron Plain looks at the market shock from the USDA's quarterly hogs and pigs report. Tamra Jackson-Ziems describes northern corn leaf blight and gray leaf spot. Zach Rystrom discusses his research with soybean stem borer, and Bob Wright talks about scouting for corn rootworms. Roy Smith is our corn and soybean market analyst this week. The USDA Monday released its numbers on quarterly grain stocks and 2014 planted acreage. The agency is estimating U.S. farmers planted 91.6 million acres of corn and 84.8 million acres of soybeans. The amount of soybean acres is far and away a record. The previous high was set in 2009 at 77.5 million acres. Nebraska is expected to increase its share by 600,000 acres. In fact, Oklahoma is the only state expected to actually lower its soybean plantings. The USDA totaled corn stocks in all positions at 3.85 billion bushels and soybean stocks at 405 million bushels. Both markets reacted unfavorably after the release. We started our interview with Roy Wednesday afternoon by asking for an update on crop conditions in his area of southeast Nebraska.
Right here in Cass County, they look very good. We've had some rain, but not an excessive amount of rain, and cool weather once in a while, so things really look about as good as we could hope for.
What was your reaction to the USDA numbers on Monday? Certainly the markets didn't like them very much.
That wasn't as good as the weather, I'll say that. My reaction, we saw quite an increase in soybean plantings, and I think that, to me, that wasn't a surprise. I think most farmers probably, if the truth were known, they probably would say that they kind of expected that too. And so, but the trade was long soybeans, they were long corn, and we saw that big number come out, 2 million bushels more than what the trade was anticipating, and so the market went down.
Your philosophy is to be out of cash corn by July 1st. Was that hard to do with the current price levels?
Well, you know, trucks have wheels and augers have the ability to move corn, so, but yeah, psychologically it was kind of tough to do. You know, in the back of my mind, I know that that's something I have to do every year, is clean the bins out before the 1st of July, and I got that done with a couple days to spare, and this week, looking back on that, it was certainly a good decision, because we're about 30 cents a bushel under where we were last week at this time.
Were there any positive numbers that you saw in either of the USDA reports?
I'd say there were some numbers that weren't as negative as what 70-cent soybean price drop would be. The planting intentions for soybeans was very large and negative. However, the stocks of soybeans is still very tight. Corn is kind of the other way around. There's plenty of corn around, but the planting intentions for corn actually went down a little bit. Not very much, but they at least they didn't go up. And if the planting intentions for corn would have gone up, then that would have been extremely negative too, because we've been trading a big corn crop now for, gosh, over a year, I think. And so, you know, you look at all of those numbers, and some positive and some negative. On the whole, they were negative, but we've got a lot of summer left too, and I frankly don't expect the crop to look this good all summer. You know, hope it does, but you don't want to expect that.
Well, we were trading pretty high in the soybean market as well, and finally it broke, but could it maybe gain some ground back in the other direction?
Well, I would think at some point it will. You know, we may have to go down quite a while. I mean, it's still the next really landmark seasonal trend is the September crop report. There's another report coming out before that, but the one that's really important is September, and the trade has a tendency to go up before the report and down after the report, just like this one that we had. So you know, there's time for, I guess if you look at the long-term seasonal price trends, normally there'll be one big rally sometime between now and the 10th of September. When it's going to come is anybody's guess. You know, there could be a frost in North Dakota or something like that. I don't think we're going to have drought in the near future, but some minor appearing, but major, in fact, of the effect on the crop to cause a rally of 50 cents or $1, or who knows. You know, I don't know what the number is, but a lot of times you'll see that just for no apparent reason, and then the market goes up and then it goes back down. And for people that are still sitting on crops that need to be sold, that's when you want to be ready to pull the trigger and don't get caught with last year's crop in this year's bins.
The July crop report is scheduled for release Friday, July 11th at 11 a.m. Central Time. We also have hog market analysis this week with University of Missouri Extension economist Ron Plain. Lean hog futures took off at the beginning of the week thanks to the USDA's quarterly hogs and pigs report released before the weekend. As Ron said when we talked Tuesday, the shocker in those numbers was the USDA's tally of all hogs and pigs at 62.1 million head, down 5% from June 2013.
That was a big surprise. Nearly 2% fewer market hogs than the trade was expecting. Lowest summer inventory in years. In fact, it looks like hog slaughter this year will be the smallest since 2006.
Both market hog inventory and pigs saved per litter were down, and as you mentioned, that last stat there, what impacts do those have on overall production?
Well, we were down 5.1% in pigs per litter during the spring quarter. Historically, we usually expect up 1 or 2%, but the PED virus has really changed things, and so we're down sharply, and that's the big reason we have 5% fewer market hogs, is so many hog farms are struggling to deal with the PED virus.
Do you think now we're seeing less of an influence from PEDV?
Well, perhaps a bit. USDA said that pigs per litter during the winter was down 5.5%, during the spring down 5.1%. That's a little bit of improvement. We expect we'll see a little less impact during the summer, but still this is devastating for a lot of hog farms.
Any positive angles to the quarterly hogs and pigs report?
Well, fewer hogs mean higher prices. The futures market was up the limit on a good chunk of the contracts on Monday following the release of the pig report. So that's good news for hog prices and hog farmers. The farrowing intentions for the summer up only 0.1%. USDA earlier had talked about 2.4% more sows farrowing this summer, so less growth than we had been expecting back in March.
Was that an indication of how surprised the market was, its reaction on Monday?
Yes, that's also part of the thing. Fewer sows farrowing boost the markets. Hog farms have been making good money, but still it looks like PED virus has got them uneasy enough that they're not quite ready to expand the sow herd yet.
Right, and with that tight production, could those high prices continue?
Well, it looks like it's going to. Retail prices have been record high the last 3 months in a row, right at $4.10 a pound for pork during the month of May. And so high grocery store prices pumps money down through the system, so we're probably going to see hog prices move a bit higher than they've already been.
On the farrow to finish side, what are producers experiencing for profit margins?
Records. March, April, and May were larger profits per head sold than any previous months in history. $91 or so in March, $81 in range in April, $74 in May. And we're probably going to see July and August profits, looks right now, maybe up close to $100 per head.
Give me an update on the export market, Ron.
We're doing well. Despite record high pork prices, we're exporting more pork. We were up 10% in pork exports in the first third of this year. Mexico, China, and South Korea all buying a lot more pork than they did a year ago.
And finally, Ron, this week's USDA reports for corn and soybeans were very bearish. Prices fell early in the week. What impact could that have on feed prices for hog producers?
Well, if we produce a lot of corn this year, it's going to mean lower feed costs. We've seen a dramatic decline in the cost of production for hogs. We're looking at break-evens on a live weight basis around 57 cents. A good corn crop and a good bean crop, and we could see that drop on down into the lower 50s late in this year. And so that also is going to add to the profit margin for hog farmers.
The current number of states with a positive PEDV test stands at 30. The next quarterly Hogs and Pigs report is scheduled for release Friday, September 26th. Weather conditions continue to be favorable for some corn diseases. That's according to UNL Extension plant pathologist Tamra Jackson-Ziems. Tamra says two that are now popping up in a few Nebraska locations are northern cornleaf blight and gray leaf spot. Northern cornleaf blight can be found with its cigar-shaped marks, while gray leaf spot has small, grayish-brown rectangular spots. While the problems aren't statewide, Tamra says producers can be scouting now in case they need to treat.
Well, we're starting to see some northern cornleaf blight and even some gray leaf spot now too. And this is not a widespread problem at this point, but I think the important thing is to make everyone aware that the weather conditions have been supportive for these fungal infections.
Humid conditions, meaning?
Absolutely. High humidity, frequent rainfall, everything we've been getting, and these warm temperatures. And so especially northern cornleaf blight likes it a little bit cooler, and that's just what we've had.
With that problem, what should producers be looking for in their fields?
Well, these are fungal pathogens and they're residue borne, and so these are diseases that begin on the lower leaves first, and they work their way up the plant and higher as long as the conditions are favorable.
How do you determine if you need to treat, and has treatment been successful to try and control this?
Well, both of these pathogens are fungal, and they can be treated successfully with our foliar fungicides. The fields I've seen so far probably were not to that point yet. We look for a severity of the disease and how much leaf area is covered and how high on the plant it is, because of course we want to protect especially our ear leaf and above that for yield.
With northern cornleaf blight, what management decisions can you make in the future that would maybe minimize the chance of you seeing this again in your fields?
Well, in particular for northern cornleaf blight, it's not one we see every year, but we're seeing it more and more. And so for northern, I recommend people, when they select their hybrids in the fall, make sure and look for ones that have a better rating for northern cornleaf blight resistance. And especially keep in mind too, this fungus is variable. We have at least 2 races of it that can occur, and so a couple things to keep in mind there.
Crop rotation?
Absolutely. Crop rotation is the other one. Good choice there. Crop rotation, if people are still managing residue with tillage, that can help. But of course, remember, this is a systems approach, and there are a lot of benefits to no-till. And
you said this can kind of look like Goss's wilt as well. What about gray leaf spot?
Gray leaf spot's out there too. Similar management recommendations. Of course, a fungicide can help manage it if you think you need it, as well as crop rotation.
You said before that at tasseling you found that fungicides are more effective than maybe before in the season.
In previous years in our annual foliar fungicide trials, we've gotten our most consistent benefits from applications made around that tasseling or shortly thereafter, those time stages. And so that'd be something to keep in mind, but part of that is because of the weather. It's conducive around that time period. So people need to get out and scout their fields, and especially targeting those hybrids that they know are sensitive.
On the Market Journal website, we'll link to Tamra's Crop Watch article with more information and videos about these diseases. Before the World Cup began in Brazil, Deb Borg, a Nebraska Corn Board director from Allen, was part of a spring agriculture trade mission to the South American nation. The July Nebraska Farmer on its cover and an inside feature explains the purpose of the Brazilian tour and describes what farmers from Nebraska, Iowa, and Ohio learned there. Borg says the Brazilian farmers readily accept biotech crops because they market most of their grain to countries with hungry populations needing safe, quality, and affordable food. You can read more about her thoughts on the tour in the July Nebraska Farmer. We traveled to Clay Center last Friday for a weed management field day. We'll show you our interview with Amit Jalla on weed control in a following episode. This week, we'll show you interviews on insect pressures, including one with UNL entomology grad student Zach Rystrom. Zach is conducting research on the soybean stem borer and talked with us about the pest and how it affects the plant.
So the soybean stem borer is a small gray longhorn beetle that is a pest of soybeans in the south central area of Nebraska. The kind of damage that it causes is that it will cause late season lodging prior to harvest in soybean fields. It does this because the adults lay their eggs throughout the season, and those larvae will then hatch, bore up and down the main stem of the plant, and at the end of the season it prepares an overwintering chamber. It overwinters in the soybean stubble, and the act of doing that causes a soybean plant to be susceptible to lodging.
When during the year does it move into soybeans?
The adults will move into this year's soybean fields beginning in mid to late June, and then throughout the rest of the summer on into August.
How do you know in your soybean field that you have damage? Are there certain things that you can look for or certain things that you should scout for?
Some signs of damage that you can look for is just the insects themselves, or the adults lay their eggs in the soybean leaf petioles, and so when the larva hatches and moves into the main stem, that petiole at the entry node will actually wilt, dry up, and fall to the ground. So a dried up leaf in an otherwise healthy canopy is a sign of an infestation, although it's already too late when you see that. So
you're doing some research here in south central Nebraska. What are you looking at?
We're looking at emergence. We have an emergence study. We're looking at the egg laying that the adults do, what time of year that this happens, and we're also having some sweep net sampling studies just in commercial fields throughout the south central portion of the state.
And anything interesting to note or anything interesting that you're finding yet?
We're finding out things that we don't know. We know that they emerge over an extended period of time, which makes timing for insecticide applications very difficult, and we're just finding out problems like management issues. So.
The soybean stem borer research is funded by the Nebraska Soybean Board. Zach says he hopes to learn from this work more about life stages and cycles of the stem borer in order to aid in timing of insecticide applications. While at the field day, we also spoke with UNL Extension entomologist Bob Wright about corn rootworms. For the most part, the USDA National Agricultural Statistics Service sees a nice-looking Nebraska corn crop. This week's crop ratings put it 70% good to excellent with 1% silking. Now into July, Bob says farmers can start looking in those fields for signs of rootworm damage.
The larvae are getting pretty big in a lot of parts of the state, and particularly with all the wet weather we've had, people may see some corn lodging in the next couple of weeks. And it's important to know whether the lodging was caused by rootworm feeding or not. So if you do see lodged corn, dig around the roots and see if you can find some larvae. We can have lodging without rootworm feeding, so we don't always want to assume that lodging is caused by rootworms.
And if you find some of that, what do you do with it?
Well, at this time of year, it's too late to control them, but be thinking about next year and be watching for the adults as well this summer in terms of whether they could interfere with pollination or just cause a lot of damage next year.
You're doing some research here in Clay Center looking at resistance, and we've talked about this on the show before. Specifically here, what are you looking at?
Well, what we've been doing a couple of locations across the state is comparing all the available hybrids, the BT rootworm hybrids, with different types of BT proteins and seeing how they're performing in the field, and also doing laboratory studies with Dr. Lance Meinke in Lincoln. And here what we've found is that earlier we had found resistance to the BT trait or the BT protein that's in the Monsanto hybrids, the Cry3BB1 protein, and this is similar to what they found in Iowa and Illinois and some other states. We've also found evidence of resistance to the protein that's in the Syngenta Agrasure rootworm hybrid. And what was interesting was 2 years ago, the populations here were still susceptible to that Agrasure rootworm protein. Last year, we had evidence that resistance had built up here too. So the thing is, it's changing. We don't have a complete picture of what's going on in the state, but you want to be watching your fields in terms of evaluating whether you're getting good control. Mid-July is a good time to dig some roots and see if you're seeing injury from rootworms. Wash off the soil and see if you can see the characteristic pruning of the roots from rootworms. And if you have had problems in the past with the rootworms, crop rotation is a very effective management tool, the best option we have. Insecticidal options are also possible. The other thing that we're seeing in these trials across the state is that the stacked hybrids with two different BT proteins active against rootworms are very effective, and there's several different sources of those from different companies. So if you are having problems with performance of the BT traits against rootworms for a single traded hybrid, the two traded or stacked hybrids are still working effectively.
Do you have an idea or a thought as to why they're adapting so quickly, why the rootworms are adapting so quickly?
Well, they've had a past history of adapting to insecticides, and particularly a soil insect. They have a narrow host range. If they don't feed on corn, they die. So there's a lot of selection pressure. And then if you use the same hybrid repeatedly, where we've seen problems is where people use the same hybrid or the same type of BT. Originally in Iowa, it was 3 or more years. They saw a correlation with the resistance populations, and we have people in Nebraska who've been using the first rootworm hybrid for 5 or 6 years or more in the same field without rotation, so that puts a lot of selection pressure on the rootworms.
How long would that area be susceptible? As in, how long would it take before you could come back with that same variety in that same field?
We haven't done those studies. In some cases, with insecticides, the insecticide trait, resistance trait persists even after you stop using it. Probably if you do have resistance in an area, again, the two options would be to rotate. That would knock down the population so that you wouldn't have a problem the next years, or use a hybrid with 2 different BT proteins that are active against rootworms. And those are still effective across the Midwest.
We'll have more from the Weed Management Field Day in Clay Center next week. Also next week, UNL Extension will hold herbicide-resistant weed management field days in Fremont on July 9th and Lincoln on the 10th. Those are sponsored by the Nebraska Soybean Board. The events are free, but pre-registration is required by Monday for meal counts and teaching materials. You can find more information on our website. Now, with this week's weather forecast, here's UNL Extension State Climatologist Al Dutcher.
Well, folks, here we are again for the weekly forecast, and I hope you had a very enjoyable 4th of July, and hopefully it was safe. We did see some scattered thunderstorm activity last weekend into the early part of the week, and some of that developed on Monday into some severe weather from west central portions of Iowa eastward through northern Illinois, and has had some flooding and rainfall, but its origin started essentially in the Broken Bow area, and thankfully we escaped the vast majority of the flooding and significant severe weather damage, and it shifted to our east. And in the absence of that moisture, we still had impressive June precipitation totals. And if we go and look at the graphics in regards to the precipitation, the one thing I'll draw your attention to is the northeastern part of the state has seen anywhere from 8.5 up to 17 inches of moisture during the month of June. And then we had a broad-based area of 8+ inches to approximately 10 inches across a good portion of central Nebraska. The driest area of the state was the western part of the state, essentially the Scottsbluff area. We've seen anywhere from 1 to 2 inches, and as we got to the eastern portion of the Panhandle, looking in the area of about 2 to 5 inches of moisture was very common. In terms of surpluses, we're looking at broad-based surpluses across the state. 9 inches surpluses in central portions of central Nebraska and northeast Nebraska, but everybody was pretty much in the 3 to 6 inch surplus range. And if you think about this in context of precipitation, we were essentially looking in the northeast part of the state. 60% of the annual precipitation that we normally get fell in 1 month, so very impressive totals. In terms of the upper air models, what we have going today is a thunderstorm complex that started to develop over north central Nebraska and eastern Nebraska last night is now shifting over into Iowa. We should see some residual thunderstorm activity this morning before it pretty much shifts east of the state. We may see some redevelopment late this afternoon, but it looks to be very isolated in nature. The warmth starts to build in. Looks like just a chance of isolated thunderstorm activity across extreme northeastern Nebraska, but for everybody else, if we do see anything, it'll be very isolated in nature. But temperatures are definitely going to zoom back up into the normal to above normal range. We'll be looking at upper 80s, low 90s across northeast Nebraska, all the way to the upper 90s across southwest Nebraska. As we go into Monday, we see that the frontal boundary is situated so that it just crosses northeast Nebraska. We're looking at hot conditions across the southwest with near triple-digit readings. We'll be looking well into the 90s for most areas of the state. Now we start to see this front sagging southward as we get into Tuesday. As a cold front approaches, that may generate some thunderstorm activity across northern Nebraska, and some of this may sag southeastward during the overnight hours. And by the time we get to Wednesday, that cold air will still be trying to push a little bit farther south, and that may push the thunderstorm activity into northern Kansas and southern Nebraska. And as we get into the late afternoon, we'll start to see this ridge starting to build backwards, so we may already see some thunderstorm development across the western part of the state shifting eastward. As we get into Thursday, this looks like the best chance for scattered thunderstorm activity and severe weather as we get a warm front moving across the state, generating very good precipitation from west to east, and that'll clear the state on Friday and bring hot conditions into the state. So if we look at the temperature forecast, there's a chance of thunderstorms in there pretty much the entire time, but the best opportunity really is next Thursday statewide. We look at the 8 to 14 day forecast, cool and normal conditions from next Thursday to the following Tuesday. In terms of precipitation, we're looking at 2 distinct areas above normal moisture.
Thanks, Al. Today's information on grain markets, corn diseases, hog markets, soybean stem borer, and corn rootworms can be found individually on the Market Journal website and through the Market Journal mobile app. Next week, Lowell Sandell will describe the impact of volunteer corn, and Curtis Harms will look at the growth of agricultural education in Nebraska high schools, while at the same time, those programs face a shortage of ag teachers. Until then, thanks for watching. I'm Jeff Wilkerson. We'll see you next week.
Join Market Journal online at marketjournal.unl.edu. You can also follow us on Facebook and Twitter. Promotional support is provided by the Nebraska Farmer Magazine. Funding for Market Journal is provided by the Nebraska Soybean Board. The Soybean Checkoff, growing opportunity from the ground up. Market Journal is produced by the University of Nebraska-Lincoln's Institute of Agriculture and Natural Resources. Funding for Market Journal is provided by the Nebraska Soybean Board.
A diesel-powered engine on a farm works hard and operates in a grueling environment. Soy biodiesel fuels stand up to the challenge of powering farm equipment, but are also renewable and environmentally responsible as well. The Nebraska Soybean Board is committed to encouraging the use of soy biodiesel to protect the environment and sustain Nebraska's agriculture. The Nebraska Soybean Checkoff, growing opportunity from the ground up.